Hi, I'm Sandra, and I'm 28 years old. Growing up in a middle-class family in Ohio, I always believed that one day my father would finally see my worth. Despite years of criticism and constant put-downs, I held on to hope that our relationship could change. I worked hard, built a successful career, and thought maybe, just maybe, at his 60th birthday dinner things would be different. I was wrong. What happened that night at our family table changed everything forever, but not in the way I expected. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner table, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that matter. Now let me take you back to where this all began. Looking back, I should have seen the signs earlier. My childhood in suburban Toledo was filled with moments that shaped who I became, though I didn't understand their impact at the time. My father, Frank, worked as an insurance adjuster, spending his days evaluating damage and determining what was worth saving. My mother, Carol, was a part-time nurse who seemed to spend most of her energy trying to keep peace in our household. From as early as I can remember, nothing I did was ever quite good enough for my father. When I brought home report cards with A's and B's, he would focus on why I hadn't gotten all A's. When I dressed up for school pictures, he would criticize my hair or tell me I needed to stand straighter. During family dinners, he would compare me to my cousins or neighbors' kids, always pointing out how they were doing better in some way. My mother would try to mediate these situations, often pulling me aside afterward to tell me that Daddy loved me. He just wanted me to be my best. But even as a child, I could see how she walked on eggshells around him, how her voice got tighter when he was in a bad mood, how she would frantically clean the house before he came home from work. The criticism wasn't limited to big moments. It was woven into everyday life. The way I held my fork, how I laughed too loudly, my choice of friends, the books I read, even the way I walked down the hallway. Everything was subject to his judgment and found lacking. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, hoping that if I could just be perfect enough, I might earn his approval. When I graduated high school, I knew I had to get away. I applied to Ohio State University and worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for what my partial scholarship didn't cover. Moving to Columbus felt like taking my first real breath in 18 years. For the first time, I could make decisions without wondering what cutting comment would follow. College was transformative. I threw myself into my marketing classes and discovered I had a talent for understanding what motivated people. I joined study groups, made friends who laughed at my jokes, instead of telling me to quiet down, and slowly began to believe that maybe I wasn't as worthless as I had been told. During those 4 years, my contact with my family was minimal. My mother would call every few weeks, updating me on neighborhood gossip and family news, always ending with a guilt-inducing comment about how much they missed me and when was I coming home. My father rarely got on the phone, and when he did, the conversations were brief and awkward. After graduation, I landed a good position at a growing tech startup in Columbus. The work was challenging and rewarding, and my supervisors appreciated my dedication and creative thinking. For the first time in my life, I was receiving regular positive feedback about my abilities and contributions. But even as my career flourished, I struggled with self-doubt and anxiety that I couldn't quite explain. A friend suggested therapy, and though I was hesitant at first, I eventually found a counselor who helped me understand how my childhood experiences had shaped my adult relationships and self-perception. Through therapy, I began to recognize patterns I hadn't seen before. How I constantly sought approval from authority figures, how I minimized my own achievements, how I stayed in relationships with people who treated me poorly because it felt familiar. It was painful work, but gradually I started to build a healthier sense of self-worth. My career continued to advance. Within 3 years, I had been promoted to senior marketing coordinator, managing campaigns for major clients and leading a small team. I was earning more money than I had ever imagined possible, and for the first time I felt financially secure and independent. Around this time I met Marcus, a software engineer who worked for a different company, but moved in similar professional circles. He was kind, supportive, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared goals. He encouraged my ambitions and celebrated my successes without trying to diminish them. As my life in Columbus became more stable and fulfilling, I began to feel ready to set some boundaries with my family. I was no longer the insecure teenager who had left Toledo. I had proven to myself that I was capable, intelligent, and valuable. Maybe I thought I could finally have an adult relationship with my parents based on mutual respect. That's when my mother called about my father's 60th birthday celebration. The family was planning a gathering at their house, she explained, with extended relatives coming from out of state. "It would mean so much to your father if you could be there," she said. "He's getting older and family is so important." I found myself torn between my desire to maintain the peace I had built in my life and a stubborn hope that maybe this milestone birthday would be an opportunity for a fresh start. Maybe my success and maturity would finally earn the respect that had always eluded me. After talking it over with Marcus and my therapist, I decided to attend. I prepared myself, mentally setting internal boundaries about what behavior I would and wouldn't accept. I was no longer a child who had to endure whatever was thrown at me. I was an adult who could choose how to respond. The drive back to Toledo filled me with nervous anticipation. I had packed carefully, choosing clothes that reflected my professional success but weren't too flashy. I wanted to show that I had done well for myself without appearing to show off. Even after all these years, I was still trying to thread that impossible needle of my father's approval. Pulling into the driveway of my childhood home felt like stepping back in time. The house looked exactly the same, from the slightly crooked mailbox my father had never bothered to fix to the flower beds my mother obsessively maintained. Even the smell when I walked through the front door was unchanged, a mixture of my mother's vanilla candles and my father's aftershave. My mother greeted me with a hug that was both desperate and nervous. She looked older than I remembered, with new lines around her eyes and a tightness in her smile that suggested she was already worried about how the evening would go. She immediately launched into a flurry of activity, taking my coat, offering me something to drink, asking about my drive, all while stealing glances toward the living room where I could hear my father's voice. The extended family had already arrived. Uncle Gerald, my father's older brother, stood up to greet me with genuine warmth. He had always been the more easygoing of the two brothers, and I remembered him being kind to me during childhood visits. Aunt Phyllis, his wife, embraced me and commented on how grown-up and professional I looked. My cousins Danny and Janet were there too, both with their own families now. Danny worked in construction and had married his high school girlfriend. Janet had become a teacher and had two young children who were running around the living room, bringing an energy to the house that it rarely had when I was growing up. When I finally encountered my father, he was holding court in his favorite armchair, a beer in his hand, and that familiar expression of mild disapproval on his face. He looked up when I entered the room, gave me a brief nod, and said, "Sandra, you made it." There was no warmth in his voice, no acknowledgement that I had traveled several hours to be there for his birthday. I responded politely, wishing him a happy birthday, and commenting on how nice it was that so much family could be together. He accepted this with the same cool detachment he had always shown me, then immediately turned his attention back to a conversation he had been having with Uncle Gerald about local politics. My mother hovered nearby, clearly hoping for some warmer interaction between us. But when it became obvious that wasn't going to happen naturally, she quickly ushered me into the kitchen to help with dinner preparations. I could feel the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same anxiety I had felt as a child when trying to navigate his moods. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself falling back into old family dynamics despite my best intentions. I caught up with my relatives, sharing carefully edited versions of my life in Columbus. I talked about my job, mentioning the promotion and the interesting projects I was working on, but downplaying the salary and the recognition I had received. Janet seemed genuinely interested in my career and asked thoughtful questions about the marketing industry. Danny was more reserved but polite. Uncle Gerald made a point of telling me how proud he was of what I had accomplished, which felt both wonderful and strange since I wasn't used to that kind of support from family members. But throughout these conversations, I could feel my father's presence like a storm cloud. Even when he wasn't directly participating, his energy dominated the room. Everyone seemed to be performing slightly, making sure their voices weren't too loud, their laughter not too boisterous, their opinions not too controversial. When my father did insert himself into conversations, it was often to correct someone or to offer his own opinion as if it were fact. When Janet mentioned a new teaching method she was excited about, he dismissed it as more of this modern nonsense that's ruining education. When Danny talked about a project his construction crew was working on, my father found multiple ways to criticize the approach they were taking. But it was when the conversation turned to me that his demeanor became particularly pointed. When Uncle Gerald asked about my apartment in Columbus, my father interjected to comment on how expensive rent must be in the city, and how I was probably wasting money on unnecessary luxuries. When Aunt Phyllis complimented a necklace I was wearing, he made a comment about people who spend money on jewelry instead of saving for the future. Each comment was delivered with a slight smile, as if he were just making conversation, but I could feel the familiar sting of his disapproval. It was the same pattern I remembered from childhood, but now I had the perspective to see how calculated it was, how he seemed to take pleasure in diminishing me in front of others. My mother kept trying to redirect conversations or smooth over tense moments, but her efforts only seemed to highlight how uncomfortable the dynamic was. She would laugh a little too loudly at his comments, or quickly change the subject when his criticism became too pointed. As we moved toward dinner, I helped my mother in the kitchen, grateful for a few minutes away from the living room tension. She was stressed about getting everything perfect for his birthday meal, checking and rechecking the roast, adjusting the table settings, making sure his favorite beer was properly chilled. When I suggested a simpler approach to the mashed potatoes she was struggling with, my father appeared in the kitchen doorway and immediately criticized my suggestion. "That's not how your mother does it," he said dismissively. "She knows what she's doing. You don't need to fix what isn't broken." It was such a small thing, but it carried the weight of years of similar interactions. The message was clear. My input wasn't wanted, my experience didn't matter, my presence was barely tolerated. I saw my mother's face fall slightly as she realized the tension was already building, and I felt that familiar mix of anger and protectiveness toward her. She had spent decades walking this same tightrope, trying to keep everyone happy while slowly losing pieces of herself in the process. As we prepared to sit down for dinner, I tried to summon the confidence I had built over the past few years. I reminded myself that I was successful, that I had people in my life who valued and respected me, that this man's opinion of me didn't define my worth. But being back in this environment, surrounded by the same dynamics that had shaped my childhood, made it harder to hold on to that knowledge. The dining room table was set with my mother's best china, the same pattern she had used for special occasions throughout my childhood. My father took his place at the head of the table, and the rest of us arranged ourselves around him like planets orbiting the sun. The conversation was pleasant enough at first, focused on catching up and sharing family news. But I could sense the undercurrent of tension, the way everyone was being careful with their words, the way my mother kept glancing nervously between my father and me. It felt like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something to go wrong. As we settled around the dining room table for the birthday meal, the atmosphere felt deceptively peaceful. My mother had outdone herself with the spread perfectly seasoned roast beef, creamy mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, and fresh dinner rolls. The good china caught the light from the chandelier, and for a moment it almost felt like the harmonious family gathering I had hoped for. The initial conversation flowed easily enough. We talked about the children's school activities, Uncle Gerald's recent retirement, and Aunt Phyllis's new garden. I shared some carefully chosen stories about my work, focusing on projects that sounded interesting but not too impressive. I had learned long ago to moderate my achievements when talking to my father. But as the meal progressed, I noticed the familiar shift in my father's demeanor. He had finished his second beer and was settling into what I remembered as his holding court mode. His voice got slightly louder, his opinions more pronounced, and his attention turned increasingly toward finding fault with whatever topic was being discussed. When Janet mentioned that her school was implementing new technology in the classrooms, my father launched into a lengthy critique of how computers were making children lazy and unable to think for themselves. When Danny talked about his construction company's new safety protocols, my father dismissed them as more government interference in business. I tried to stay out of these conversations, focusing on my meal and offering neutral responses when directly addressed, but I could feel his attention turning toward me like a searchlight, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I became his primary target. The shift happened when Uncle Gerald asked me about my career prospects and whether I was thinking about buying a house. It was an innocent question, the kind of thing family members ask when they haven't seen you in a while. I answered honestly that I was considering it, that my job was going well, and that I felt financially stable enough to take that step. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Financially stable," he repeated with a slight laugh. "On a marketing salary, I hope you're not getting ahead of yourself. The housing market is complicated, and you don't want to end up in over your head." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice even. "I've been saving for several years, and I've done my research on the market in Columbus. I think I'm in a good position to make that decision." "Research," he said, and there was something in his tone that made the whole table go quiet. "That's the problem with your generation. You think reading a few articles online makes you an expert. Real financial decisions require experience and wisdom." The implication was clear. I lacked both. I could see my mother shooting warning glances at my father, silently pleading with him not to start something. But he seemed energized by having an audience and a target. "I mean, look at your choices so far." He continued, his voice gaining momentum. "You moved to an expensive city, you're probably paying twice what you should for rent, you're working for some startup that could disappear tomorrow. That's not stability, that's playing with fire." I felt the familiar heat rising in my cheeks, the same feeling I had experienced countless times as a child when he would dissect my decisions in front of others. But this time, something was different. This time I knew he was wrong. "My company has been growing consistently for 5 years, I said quietly. "I've been promoted twice, and I've built a strong professional reputation. My rent is reasonable for the area, and I live within my means." "Promoted twice," he repeated with mock admiration. "In 5 years. That's not exactly climbing the corporate ladder at lightning speed, is it?" I could feel everyone at the table growing uncomfortable. Danny was studying his plate intently. Janet had stopped eating altogether. Uncle Gerald cleared his throat as if he might say something, but my father's momentum was building and there was no stopping him now. "The truth is, Sandra, you've always been impractical. Even as a child, you had these grand ideas about what you could accomplish, but you never had the follow-through. Remember when you wanted to be a writer or when you thought you'd be a famous artist? You jumped from one thing to another without ever really committing or succeeding." Each word felt like a physical blow. He was rewriting history, painting my childhood dreams as evidence of failure rather than normal developmental exploration. But worse than that, he was doing it in front of our entire extended family, people I saw maybe once a year, and whose opinion of me would be shaped by this moment. "I think Sandra has done very well for herself," Aunt Phyllis said softly, but my father barely acknowledged her interruption. "Well for herself," he said. "She's 28 years old, living alone in a rented apartment, working for a company most people have never heard of. When I was her age, I owned a house, was married, and had a clear career path with a stable company." The comparison was unfair and outdated, but that didn't matter to him. He was building towards something, and I could sense it coming like a freight train. My mother was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white. "The problem is that Sandra has always thought she was smarter than everyone else," he continued, his voice getting louder. "She went off to college and came back thinking she knew better than the people who raised her. She thinks her fancy degree and her big city job make her superior to her family. I never said that. I managed to say. But my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. You don't have to say it, he shot back. It's obvious in everything you do. The way you dress, the way you talk, the way you look at this house like it's beneath you now. You think you're too good for where you came from. This was so far from the truth that it took my breath away. I had never felt superior to my family. If anything, I had always felt like I was disappointing them, like I could never measure up to their expectations. But pointing that out would only give him more ammunition. Uncle Gerald tried to intervene. Frank, maybe we should talk about something else. This is supposed to be a celebration. But my father was beyond listening to reason. He had found his groove, and years of resentment seemed to be pouring out of him. No, I think this needs to be said. Sandra needs to understand some things about herself and about reality. He stood up from his chair, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He pointed directly at me, his face flushed with anger and alcohol, and said the words that would change everything between us forever. You'll always be worthless. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children who had been playing quietly in the next room seemed to sense that something terrible had happened. My mother looked like she might cry. Janet's mouth was slightly open in shock. Uncle Gerald was staring at his brother as if he had never seen him before. But something unexpected happened in that moment of devastation. Instead of crumbling, instead of apologizing or fleeing like I would have done as a child, I felt something shift inside me. All the work I had done in therapy, all the confidence I had built over the past few years, all the evidence I had accumulated about my own worth, came flooding back. I looked at this man who had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was worthless, and for the first time I saw him clearly. He wasn't an authority figure whose approval I needed. He wasn't a wise patriarch whose judgment carried weight. He was just a bitter, insecure man who felt threatened by his daughter's success and was trying to tear her down to make himself feel better. The realization was both devastating and liberating. This was who he really was. This was who he had always been. And I finally had the strength to stop pretending otherwise. In that moment of absolute silence, with my father's words hanging in the air like poison, something inside me crystallized. All the years of therapy, all the confidence I had built, all the evidence of my own worth that I had accumulated, came together in a moment of perfect clarity. I remembered my therapist's words about how abusers maintain control through fear and intimidation, how they tear others down because building themselves up requires too much work. I thought about my career, my achievements, the respect I had earned from colleagues and friends. I thought about Marcus, who valued my intelligence and celebrated my successes. I thought about the life I had built for myself, independent and strong and meaningful. And I realized that this man's opinion of me had exactly as much power as I chose to give it, which was none. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting to see if I would break down, apologize, or simply flee. Instead, I looked directly at my father for what felt like the first time in my adult life, meeting his gaze without flinching. Good, I said, my voice steady and clear. Then don't expect a penny from me. The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His face, which had been flushed with righteous anger moments before, went completely pale. For the first time in my memory, my father was speechless. But I wasn't finished. 28 years of swallowed words, of accepted criticism, of internalized shame came pouring out in a voice I barely recognized as my own. You want to talk about worthless, I continued. Let's talk about worthless. Worthless is spending decades tearing down your own daughter instead of building her up. Worthless is being so threatened by someone else's success that you have to destroy it to feel better about yourself. Worthless is standing up at your own birthday dinner and humiliating someone who came here hoping to honor you. My mother made a small sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, but I kept going. The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping now. You want to know what I've accomplished? I graduated from college with honors while working 3 jobs. because you told me I wasn't worth investing in. I built a career from nothing because you convinced me I'd never amount to anything. I learned to value myself because you never would." Uncle Gerald was nodding slightly, and I saw something that looked like pride in his eyes. Aunt Phyllis had tears running down her cheeks. Even Danny, who rarely showed emotion, was looking at my father with something that might have been disgust. "You think I owe you respect because you're my father?" I asked. "Respect is earned, and you've spent my entire life doing the opposite. You think I owe you gratitude because you provided food and shelter. That's the bare minimum of parenting, not something that earns you a medal." My father tried to interrupt to regain control of the situation. "You ungrateful little—" "No," I said firmly. "You don't get to talk anymore. You've had 28 years to talk, and this is what you chose to do with that time. So now it's my turn." The authority in my own voice surprised me. This was what it felt like to set boundaries, to refuse to accept unacceptable behavior, to stand up for myself without apology or qualification. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to sit there and listen, and then I'm going to leave. And you're going to remember this moment the next time you wonder why your daughter doesn't call, doesn't visit, doesn't include you in her life." I turned to address the room, including the family members who had witnessed this entire exchange. "I want everyone here to understand something. I don't hate my father. I feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for anyone who is so insecure, so small inside that they have to spend their energy destroying other people instead of building something meaningful in their own life." My mother was crying openly now, but they weren't tears of sadness. There was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like relief, as if she had been waiting for someone to say what she had never been able to say herself. "You want to cut me out of your will?" I asked my father, who was still standing there looking stunned. "Go ahead. I never expected anything from you anyway. You want to tell people I'm a disappointment? Go ahead. Anyone whose opinion matters to me already knows who I really am." I reached for my purse, preparing to leave, but I had one more thing to say. "You called me worthless, but you're wrong. I have worth because I choose to create value in the world instead of destroying it. I have worth because I lift other people up instead of tearing them down. I have worth because I learned to love myself in spite of everything you did to convince me I was unlovable." The room was completely silent except for the sound of my mother's quiet crying. My father remained frozen, his face still pale, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "I hope someday you figure out how to find your own worth without taking it away from other people," I said. "But that's your work to do, not mine. I'm done trying to earn love from someone who doesn't know how to give it." I walked around the table, stopping to hug Uncle Gerald and Aunt Phyllis, who both held me tightly and whispered words of support. I kissed Janet on the cheek and squeezed Danny's shoulder. When I got to my mother, she stood up and embraced me, and I could feel 28 years of suppressed emotion in that hug. "I'm proud of you," she whispered in my ear so quietly that only I could hear it. I looked at my father one last time. He was still standing there, still pale, still speechless. For a moment I felt something that might have been pity. This was what his need to control and diminish had cost him: his relationship with his daughter, the respect of his family, and his own dignity. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, and there was no sarcasm in my voice, just sadness, for all the years we had wasted, all the relationship we might have had if he had been able to see me as a person worth loving instead of a threat to be neutralized. Then I walked out of that house, out of that toxic dynamic, and into the rest of my life. The drive back to Columbus passed in a blur of emotions. My hands were shaking as I pulled out of the driveway, adrenaline still coursing through my system from the confrontation. Part of me couldn't believe what had just happened, what I had said, how I had finally stood up for myself after all these years. My phone started ringing before I was even out of Toledo. The first call was from Uncle Gerald. "Sandra, I want you to know that what you did back there took incredible courage," he said when I answered. "I've watched your father treat you that way for years, and I'm ashamed I never said anything. What you said needed to be said." The second call was from Janet. I've been avoiding family gatherings for the past 2 years because I couldn't stand watching him tear you down, she confessed. I should have spoken up. I should have supported you. But I'm so proud of you for finally standing up for yourself. Even Danny called, which surprised me. He wasn't much for emotional conversations, but his message was clear. That was a long time coming. Good for you. But it was my father who dominated my thoughts during that drive home. Not because I regretted what I had said, but because I was processing the reality of what our relationship had always been and what it might become. Over the next few days, my phone rang constantly. My mother called repeatedly, sometimes crying, sometimes apologizing, sometimes trying to convince me to call my father and smooth things over. But there was something different in her voice, too, something lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. He's been sulking for 3 days, she told me during one conversation. He keeps saying you embarrassed him in front of the family. But Sandra, honey, I think you said things that needed to be said. I think maybe I needed to hear them too. My father himself tried calling several times, but I let the calls go to voicemail. His messages followed a predictable pattern: anger justification, attempts at manipulation, and finally grudging half apologies that blamed me for overreacting. I may have spoken harshly, one message said, but you know I only want what's best for you. You've always been too sensitive. If you can't handle some honest feedback, how are you going to succeed in the real world? Even his apologies were criticisms. Even his attempts at reconciliation were designed to make me feel like the problem. But for the first time in my life, I could see these tactics for what they were, and they had lost their power over me. Marcus was incredibly supportive throughout this period. He listened without trying to fix anything, held me when I needed to cry, and celebrated with me when I felt proud of what I had done. "You found your voice," he said one evening as we sat on his couch. "And it's a powerful voice. I'm proud of you." Work became a refuge during this time. My colleagues noticed a change in my confidence and assertiveness. I spoke up more in meetings, took on more challenging projects, and found myself naturally stepping into leadership roles. It was as if standing up to my father had unlocked something in me that had been suppressed for years. But the most significant change was in my relationship with myself. The voice in my head that had always criticized my decisions, that had questioned my worth, that had assumed I was somehow lacking, began to quiet down. For the first time in my adult life, I began to truly believe that I was enough exactly as I was. The extended family dynamic shifted too. Uncle Gerald started calling me regularly, sharing stories about his own struggles with my father's critical nature over the years. Aunt Phyllis invited me to visit them independently, saying she wanted to maintain a relationship with me regardless of what happened with my parents. Most surprisingly, some of my father's behavior toward other family members began to change. Without me as his primary target, his criticism seemed to lose some of its focus. Or perhaps seeing someone finally stand up to him had made everyone else more willing to set their own boundaries. 3 months after the birthday dinner, my father had a minor heart attack. My mother called me from the hospital crying and begging me to come. The old me would have dropped everything and rushed to his side, grateful for an excuse to reconcile and restore the familiar dynamic. Instead, I took time to think about what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with him going forward. I talked to my therapist about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about how I could release my anger without necessarily rebuilding trust. I did visit him in the hospital, but on my terms. I brought Marcus with me for support, and I made it clear that I was there as a concerned family member, not as a daughter seeking forgiveness for setting boundaries. My father looked smaller in that hospital bed, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. For the first time, he seemed genuinely reflective about his life and his relationships. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me quietly, "about respect being earned. Maybe I haven't been the father you deserved." It wasn't a full apology, but it was closer to acknowledgement than I had ever received from him. I told him that I appreciated his willingness to reflect, but that rebuilding our relationship would require consistent change over time, not just words spoken from a hospital bed. "I don't know if I know how to change," he admitted, and for the first time I heard vulnerability instead of manipulation in his voice. "That's something you'll have to figure out," I replied. "I'm willing to have limited contact and see what develops, but I'm not going to pretend the past didn't happen or accept behavior that tears me down." It was a beginning, not a resolution. But it was an honest beginning built on boundaries and mutual respect, rather than fear and obligation. The year that followed that confrontation became a period of profound transformation, not just for me, but for our entire family dynamic. Setting that boundary with my father had created ripple effects that none of us had anticipated. My father's recovery from his heart attack was slow, and it gave him time to reflect in ways that his busy, controlling life had never allowed before. He started attending counseling initially at my mother's insistence, but gradually because he began to recognize patterns in his behavior that had damaged his relationships with everyone he claimed to love. His attempts to reconnect with me were tentative and often clumsy. He would call and try to have normal conversations about my work or the weather, but the old patterns of criticism would creep in, and I would politely but firmly end the conversation. Slowly, very slowly, he began to understand that his opinions about my life were not welcome unless they were respectful and supportive. The most surprising development was the change in my mother. For decades, she had served as a buffer between my father and the rest of the world, absorbing his criticism and deflecting his anger to protect others. But watching me stand up for myself seemed to awaken something in her that had been dormant for years. She started speaking up when he made dismissive comments about her cooking or her friends. She enrolled in a book club that met on evenings when he typically expected her to be home. She began making plans with her sisters without asking his permission first. The woman who had spent 30 years walking on eggshells was finally learning to take up space in her own life. My career continued to flourish in ways that surprised even me. The confidence I had discovered in that confrontation with my father translated into a new assertiveness at work. I started proposing innovative campaigns that my more cautious colleagues wouldn't have dared suggest. I volunteered for high-visibility projects and wasn't afraid to take credit for my contributions. Within 6 months, I was promoted to marketing director, a position that came with significant responsibility and a salary that finally allowed me to stop worrying about money. When I called to share the news with my family, my father's response was telling. Instead of finding ways to diminish the achievement, he simply said, "Congratulations. That sounds like an important position." It wasn't effusive praise, but it was the absence of criticism which felt like progress. My relationship with Marcus deepened during this period too. Watching me find my voice and set boundaries had impressed him, but more than that, it had allowed me to show up more fully in our relationship. I was no longer constantly seeking validation or apologizing for taking up space. I could be present and authentic in ways that I had never been able to before. When he proposed 8 months after the birthday dinner incident, I said yes, without the second guessing that had plagued my previous relationships. I knew who I was now, and I knew that I deserved to be loved for exactly that person. Planning our wedding became an interesting test of the new boundaries I had established with my family. My father wanted to walk me down the aisle, a tradition he seemed to view as his right. But I had complicated feelings about symbolically being given away by someone who had spent years trying to convince me I was worthless. After much consideration, I decided that both of my parents could walk me partway down the aisle, but that I would walk the final steps alone, symbolizing my independence and self-possession. It was a compromise that honored their role in my life while asserting my autonomy. My father struggled with this decision, initially arguing that it wasn't traditional and that people would think it was strange. But when I calmly explained that this was what would make me feel comfortable and authentic on my wedding day, he eventually accepted it. The old version of me would have capitulated to avoid conflict. The new version held firm while remaining respectful. The wedding itself was beautiful, filled with people who had supported my growth and celebrated my happiness. My father's behavior throughout the event was careful and respectful. He didn't try to dominate conversations or offer unsolicited advice about my marriage. He simply showed up and participated, which felt like a significant victory. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during his father of the bride speech. Instead of talking about his hopes for my future or offering marriage advice, he did something completely unexpected. He apologized. "I want to acknowledge that I haven't always been the father Sandra deserved," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "She became the strong, successful woman she is today, not because of me, but despite me. I'm grateful that she's given me the opportunity to try to do better, and I'm proud of the life she's built for herself." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. My mother was crying openly, and even Uncle Gerald looked emotional. For me, it was validation that the difficult work of setting boundaries had been worth it. Change was possible even in relationships that had seemed hopeless. My professional success continued to grow. I was invited to speak at marketing conferences about innovative campaign strategies. I started mentoring younger colleagues who reminded me of my former self, helping them find their confidence and assert their value in the workplace. One particular mentee, a young woman named Carol, who was brilliant but constantly apologized for her ideas, reminded me so much of my younger self that it was almost painful. I worked with her to recognize her patterns of self-diminishment and helped her practice presenting her ideas with confidence. "You don't have to apologize for being smart," I told her during one of our sessions. "You don't have to make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. Your ideas have value because they're good ideas, not because someone else validates them." Watching her transformation over the months that followed was incredibly rewarding. She stopped prefacing her suggestions with apologies and started taking credit for her contributions. Her confidence grew, and so did her influence within the company. Marcus and I bought our first house together, a charming craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood near downtown Columbus. When my parents came to visit for the first time, my father walked through the rooms, quietly taking in the hardwood floors we had refinished ourselves, the garden Marcus had planted, the home office where I worked on freelance projects. "You've built a good life," he said finally, and there was no caveat, no criticism, no suggestion for improvement. Just acknowledgement of what we had accomplished. My mother was more effusive, admiring every detail and asking questions about our renovation plans. She seemed lighter somehow, more herself than I remembered her being in years. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen, she told me something that brought tears to my eyes. "Watching you stand up for yourself gave me permission to stand up for myself too," she said. "I had forgotten that I was allowed to have opinions and preferences. I had forgotten that my happiness mattered too." The most unexpected gift of this entire journey was the relationship I developed with my extended family. Uncle Gerald and I started having regular phone conversations about everything from politics to family history. Aunt Phyllis became a confidant and friend. Even Danny and I found common ground, bonding over our shared experience of growing up in my father's critical shadow. Janet and I grew especially close. She had been struggling with her own relationship with my father, feeling caught between loyalty and self-preservation. Watching me set boundaries had inspired her to have her own difficult conversations with him about respect and treatment. "You showed me it was possible," she told me during one of our long phone conversations. "You showed me that you could love someone and still refuse to accept unacceptable behavior." As I reflected on the year that had passed since that devastating birthday dinner, I realized that my father's cruel words had actually been a gift in disguise. They had finally pushed me to a place where I had no choice but to stand up for myself. They had forced me to confront the truth about our relationship and make a conscious choice about what I would and wouldn't accept. The scared, insecure girl who had driven to Toledo hoping for approval was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who could set boundaries without guilt, who could love people while still protecting herself from their harmful behavior. 2 years after that life-changing confrontation, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. Marcus and I were settled in our home, both thriving in our careers and planning to start a family. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something resembling mutual respect, built on clear boundaries and honest communication. The most significant ongoing challenge was learning to navigate my father's continued attempts to revert to old patterns. He was genuinely trying to change, but decades of ingrained behavior don't disappear overnight. There were still moments when he would slip into criticism or try to assert control over decisions that weren't his to make. The difference now was my response. Instead of absorbing his comments and internalizing them as truth, I had learned to respond calmly and directly. "That's not helpful feedback," I would say, or "I didn't ask for your opinion on that," or simply, "I'm going to end this conversation now." Each time I held a boundary, it reinforced both his understanding and my own confidence. I was no longer afraid of his disapproval, because I had learned that his approval wasn't necessary for my happiness or success. My career had reached heights I had never dared dream of. The marketing agency where I worked had promoted me to vice president, making me the youngest person ever to hold that position. I was leading major campaigns for national brands and had been featured in several industry publications as a rising star. When the local newspaper wanted to do a profile on successful young professionals in Columbus, they interviewed me about my career journey. I found myself talking honestly about the importance of self-advocacy and boundary setting, about how learning to value myself had been the foundation for professional success. The biggest obstacle to my career advancement wasn't external competition, I told the reporter. It was my own internalized belief that I wasn't worthy of success. Once I learned to see myself clearly, to recognize my own value and advocate for it, everything else followed. The article was published with a photo of me in my office surrounded by awards and recognition from various campaigns. When my father called after seeing it, his first words were, "I saw the article, I'm proud of you." No caveats, no criticism, no suggestions for improvement. Just pride. It was such a small thing, but it represented the enormous distance we had both traveled. My mother had continued her own journey of self-discovery. She had started taking art classes, something she had given up when she got married. Her paintings were actually quite good, and she had even sold a few pieces at local craft fairs. She seemed to glow with a happiness I couldn't remember seeing in her before. "I feel like I'm becoming myself again," she told me during one of our weekly phone calls. I had forgotten who I was underneath all the years of trying to keep everyone else happy. She and my father were working together in counseling, learning to communicate more honestly and treat each other with greater respect. It wasn't perfect, and there were still difficult days, but their relationship was healthier than it had been in decades. The ripple effects of that confrontation had extended far beyond our immediate family. Several of my cousins had reached out over the past 2 years to talk about their own experiences with family dynamics and boundary setting. Janet had used my example to have her own difficult conversation with my father about his treatment of her children. "You taught me that it's possible to love someone and still refuse to accept their bad behavior," she had told me. "I realized I was teaching my kids that it was normal to be criticized and diminished by family members. I couldn't let that continue." Uncle Gerald had shared that watching me stand up to my father had inspired him to address some long-standing issues in his own relationships. "You reminded me that respect has to go both ways," he said, "even in families, especially in families." As Marcus and I began trying to start our own family, I found myself thinking deeply about the kind of parent I wanted to be. I knew I would make mistakes, but I was determined to create a home environment where children felt valued, supported, and free to be themselves. "Our kids will never have to earn our love," I told Marcus one evening as we discussed our hopes for parenthood. "They'll never have to wonder if they're worthy or good enough. They'll know from the beginning that they have value simply because they exist." The contrast with my own childhood was stark, but I didn't feel bitter about it anymore. My father's limitations had shaped me, but they hadn't defined me. I had learned to find my worth within myself, which was actually a more stable foundation than external validation could ever be. When I did become pregnant several months later, my parents' reaction was telling. My mother cried with joy, and immediately started planning ways to be helpful and supportive. My father was quieter, but when he hugged me, he whispered, "You're going to be an amazing mother." It was the kind of unconditional support I had always craved from him, and receiving it now felt like a gift. Not because I needed his approval to feel confident about my parenting abilities, but because it represented how far we had all come. As I prepared for this new chapter of my life, I often reflected on that moment at the birthday dinner when everything changed. My father's cruelty had been real and damaging, but my response to it had been transformative. I had discovered that I was stronger than I knew, more valuable than I had been taught, and more capable than anyone had ever told me. The scared, seeking approval version of myself felt like a different person now. I could barely remember what it felt like to base my self-worth on other people's opinions or to accept treatment that diminished my value. The woman I had become was confident without being arrogant, strong without being defensive, loving without being doormat. Most importantly, I had learned that worth isn't something that can be given or taken away by other people. It's something inherent, something that belongs to us simply because we exist. My father could call me worthless, but that didn't make it true. Only I could determine my value, and I had finally learned to see myself clearly. The little girl who had spent years trying to earn love through perfect behavior was gone. In her place was a woman who knew she was lovable exactly as she was, who could set boundaries without guilt, who could love others without losing herself in the process. And that transformation had started with 4 simple words: "Then don't expect a penny." Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to accept it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe in your own worth, even when the people who are supposed to love you are trying to convince you otherwise. I had learned that lesson the hard way, but I had learned it completely. And now I was ready to teach it to the next generation, to break the cycle once and for all, and to create a family built on love, respect, and the unshakable belief that every person has inherent worth that no one else gets to define. My father had tried to convince me I was worthless, but he had been wrong. And proving him wrong had been the most valuable thing I had ever done. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to diminish your worth? Have you found the courage to set boundaries with family members who don't treat you with respect? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength, setting boundaries, and discovering your own worth. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they have the power to define their own value regardless of what others try to tell them. Remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and kindness, especially from the people closest to you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the courage to stand up for yourself when you need it most. Until next time, remember that your worth is not up for debate.